The first time American troops encountered the 88mm flak gun, they didn't even know what hit them. A Sherman tank moving confidently through the North African sands was suddenly pierced clean through, front to back, by an invisible shot from over a mile away. No one saw the flash. No one heard the launch. All they saw was the aftermath: fire, wreckage, and silence. It was the kind of weapon that didn't just kill, it erased. Designed originally as an anti-aircraft weapon, the 88mm Flugabwehrkanone, or Flak 88, was never meant to dominate ground combat. But the Germans, ever adaptive, realized something chilling. What could shoot a bomber at 8,000 meters could just as easily tear through a tank's armor at 2,000. It wasn't just repurposed, it was reborn, and the battlefield would never be the same again. In North Africa, under the scorching sun of Tunisia, German Afrika Korps gunners began using Flak 88s as direct-fire anti-tank weapons. The results were devastating. During the Battle of Kasserine Pass, American forces were utterly stunned. Whole armored columns were turned to ash before they could close the distance. The 88 was no longer just a gun, it was fear itself. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, the reputation of the 88 had become legendary. Infantry platoons whispered about it in foxholes. Officers warned fresh replacements. If it's silent and then something explodes, assume it's an 88. Even air support struggled against well-camouflaged positions. The Germans would hide flak guns in barns, behind haystacks, even inside buildings, only revealing them for a few deadly seconds before moving again. It wasn't just the range, it was the velocity. The Flak 88 fired armor-piercing rounds at over 800 meters per second. That meant no warning, no dodge, no escape. A shell would tear through a Sherman, pass through a wall behind it, and still have enough momentum to wound the soldier hiding beyond. It didn't just destroy, it humiliated. The Americans scrambled for answers. Engineers rushed to reinforce tank armor. Strategists redrew maps around 88 kill zones, and pilots were instructed to strafe suspected gun nests even before confirmation. Entire battalions altered their movement patterns to avoid 88 country. It changed how they fought. It changed how they thought. Even in urban combat, the Flak 88 thrived. In Caen, German gunners would position the weapons at street intersections, waiting patiently. The moment an Allied vehicle rolled into sight, it was already too late. The 88 wasn't just a battlefield tool, it was psychological warfare. Its whistle meant death. Its silence meant terror. The gun's versatility made it unstoppable. It could shoot planes, it could flatten buildings, it could kill tanks, it could break morale. The fact that it was towed, hidden, and set up in minutes only made it more terrifying. Unlike Tiger tanks, it didn't need roads or fuel convoys. It needed only a crew, a shell, and a target. What shocked the Americans most was how the Germans used such a simple tool with such terrifying effectiveness. This wasn't some futuristic superweapon. It was industrial steel, black powder, and sharp minds. They didn't overwhelm with technology. They overwhelmed with precision, patience, and perfection.
By the end of the war, every American who faced one in combat, whether tank crew, pilot, or infantryman, feared the same silhouette, that long, cold barrel rising slightly above the hedgerow. That was the king. Not the panther, not the tiger, the Flak 88. And every battlefield it touched, it ruled.
The 88 wasn't just powerful, it was terrifyingly accurate. American artillery officers were shocked when they reviewed battlefield reports. 88mm crews were routinely scoring direct hits on moving targets at ranges Allied guns couldn't even reach effectively. A Sherman tank might need to fire 3 or 4 times just to score a hit. The Flak 88, one shot, clean kill. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets were learning the same lesson. Red Army T-34s, which once ruled the battlefield with speed and sloped armor, were suddenly bursting into flames at distances well beyond their reach. German Flak 88 batteries, dug into the frozen soil near Kursk or Kharkov, would obliterate Soviet armor before it even reached the tree line. For every Soviet advance, there was a line of Flaks waiting, silent until the last second. The 88mm wasn't just a one-trick weapon. It had multiple shell types, high explosive for infantry, armor-piercing for tanks, and proximity-fused shells for aircraft. This made it a one-gun army. German crews could go from engaging a B-17 bomber to stopping a tank charge in minutes. No other weapon in World War II had this kind of flexibility. In fact, its reputation was so feared that many Allied pilots began flying higher than planned just to avoid Flak concentrations. This reduced bombing accuracy, but they preferred that to being torn apart mid-air. Even bomber crews in heavily armored flying fortresses whispered nervously about the 88s. A single direct hit could peel a B-17 like a tin can. One of the most shocking evolutions of the Flak 88 was its integration into the deadly Tiger I tank. By mounting the 88mm as its main gun, the Germans created a rolling nightmare. Suddenly, that same anti-aircraft gun that had ruled from the woods now moved on treads. In battles like Villers-Bocage or the Eastern Steppes, Tiger crews picked off Allied armor with surgical precision. American GIs gave it nicknames: the Beast, the Whispering Death, the Lightning Bolt. It wasn't just the sound it made, it was the silence before it struck. Many soldiers said that hearing a Flak 88 fire once meant you were already too late. It was fast, invisible, final. Even near the end of the war, when German fuel supplies dried up and Luftwaffe presence crumbled, the 88 was still there, defending ruins, delaying advances, bleeding time and men from Allied units. In the streets of Berlin, in the forests of the Ardennes, in bombed-out villages across Europe, 88s fired until the barrels melted. What made the 88 so deadly wasn't just hardware, it was the crews. German gunners were among the best-trained artillerymen in the war. They knew how to calculate range in seconds, adjust elevation under fire, and relocate quickly before counter-battery shells landed. The gun was brilliant. The men behind it made it legendary. The Americans eventually responded with better tanks, like the M26 Pershing, and heavier firepower. But the damage was done. The 88 had already carved its legend into scorched earth and twisted steel. Even after the war, it became a case study in weapon design, how a gun meant for one job evolved into a battlefield king. It wasn't the loudest, it wasn't the biggest, but it was the most feared. And fear, in war,
is worth more than steel. That's what made the 88 the true king, not just of the battlefield, but of the soldier's mind. American veterans who survived direct encounters with the Flak 88 rarely spoke of it without a pause. In post-war interviews, many of them described the gun not just as a weapon, but as a presence, something that loomed over every advance, every patrol, every stretch of open ground. You'd hear a crack, and then someone was gone, one GI recalled. You didn't even have time to shout, "Take cover." In the dense hedgerows of Normandy, 88s were practically invisible. German crews would fire from holes in stone walls or from within the shadow of a collapsed barn. Their location was often unknown until 2 or 3 vehicles had already been destroyed. For Allied commanders, it was like chasing ghosts with bullets. Flak 88 didn't need to move fast because they rarely had to move at all. Stories circulated of convoys halting entirely after a single hit. American drivers would rather backtrack for hours than move forward into suspected 88 zones. Recon patrols were sent out specifically to hunt the barrel, knowing that even if they spotted the gun first, it might still be too late. The fear was so widespread that some units coined the phrase "flak fever" to describe the dread of facing one. German soldiers revered the gun just as much. A well-trained flak crew was treated like an elite force. Some Wehrmacht units even requested support from flak detachments during retreats, not because of air threats, but because they knew the 88 could break an Allied pursuit. It was used not just to defend, but to send a message: you're not coming through here alive. In Italy, U.S. forces faced 88s embedded in fortified mountain positions, firing down from heights that made return fire impossible. The gun's high elevation capability, originally designed for anti-aircraft use, allowed it to dominate valleys and passes. One American general wrote in his field notes, "We can't climb the hills without being torn apart by 88s. It's like climbing into hell with no cover." Even naval commanders weren't immune to its terror. Coastal 88s hidden in bunkers along the Atlantic Wall fired at landing craft during D-Day, scoring direct hits and destroying boats in seconds. Some of these guns were so well placed that they survived hours of naval bombardment, emerging from the smoke to fire again. They didn't just delay the invasion, they bled it. After the war, the Flak 88's reputation didn't fade. Captured guns were studied extensively by Allied engineers. Some were even reused in other conflicts. Military textbooks described the 88 as a masterclass in versatility and lethality. Its legacy lived on, not only in metal and manuals, but in the nightmares of those who faced it. Surviving American veterans would point at old black-and-white photos and instantly recognize the silhouette. "There," they'd say, pointing at the barrel in the shadows. "That's the one. That's the gun that took Johnny. That's the one that cracked open Baker Company like a tin can." No one remembered who fired it, but everyone remembered what it did. To this day, museums across the world display the Flak 88 as a symbol of engineering brilliance and battlefield horror. Tourists stare at the long barrel, the solid carriage, the steel scope mounts, not realizing the fear it once represented. But the veterans remember. The commanders remember. The fields of Europe remember. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a legend written in fire, smoke, and silence. And for a moment in history, it ruled the battlefield like a ghost king, unseen, unheard, but always deadly. The Flak 88 didn't just destroy vehicles, it destroyed doctrines. Allied battlefield manuals had to be rewritten as reports came in of entire platoons wiped out by a single well-placed gun. The conventional approach of advancing tanks supported by infantry was no longer safe. With the Flak 88 out there, nothing was. Tanks that were considered state-of-the-art, like the M4 Sherman, suddenly felt outdated and fragile. Designed for mobility and mass deployment, Shermans were never intended to face down high-velocity cannons firing armor-piercing rounds. And yet that's exactly what they faced. Often, the first sign of an 88's presence was a tank turret being blown 50 feet into the air. To counter the threat, the Allies began developing tank destroyers like the M10 Wolverine and M18 Hellcat. But even these vehicles, while faster and more mobile, lacked the armor to withstand a direct hit. Speed became the only survival tactic. The Flak 88 didn't care about armor or reputation. It shredded both with equal ease. Field commanders tried flanking tactics, smoke screens, and preemptive artillery barrages to neutralize 88 nests. But the Germans were experts at repositioning. They would fire a few rounds, kill a handful of vehicles, and disappear before Allied guns could respond. Like ghosts with steel jaws, they struck, vanished, and waited. A common tactic on the German side was to pair the 88 with bait. A disabled tank or an exposed truck would be left in a field to draw in Allied repair crews or salvage units. The moment movement was detected, boom, a shot from the tree line. The 88 was not just a weapon, it was a trap. Aerial reconnaissance tried desperately to spot them, but well-camouflaged flak guns were nearly impossible to detect. German crews would hide them under netting, in barns, behind hedgerows, even inside destroyed buildings. The barrel might extend through a narrow hole in the wall, invisible until it fired. By then, the damage was done. Misidentification of targets became a recurring tragedy. Allied artillery would often shell suspected locations, only to later discover the 88s had already moved. Infantry units were sent into cleared zones and were massacred within minutes. We thought they were gone, one sergeant later recalled. But the 88 was still there, just waiting. Even in retreat, the Germans used the 88 as a delaying tool. A single gun could pin down a company for hours. In one instance, during the Battle of the Bulge, a lone 88 hidden in a church steeple held up an entire armored column. American commanders were forced to redirect entire divisions just to avoid losing more tanks. Eventually, the Allies developed better intelligence and more aggressive countermeasures. Airstrikes, saturation bombing, and specialized scouting units improved their chances, but never guaranteed safety. The Flak 88 didn't care about mistakes. It punished them, mercilessly. By war's end, the weapon had killed more tanks than any German armored vehicle. It had halted more advances than any general's order, and it had buried itself not just in fields and forests, but in the memory of every man who dared to move forward under its silent watch.
By 1945, the Flak 88 wasn't just a gun. It was a legend whispered across battlefields. American soldiers talked about it the way ancient warriors spoke of mythical beasts. If you hear it, they'd say, it's not meant for you. It's the one you don't hear that gets you.
That fear lived in the gaps between shell bursts, in the twitch of a helmet strap, in the hesitation before crossing open ground. Military planners began factoring the 88 into every major offensive. Maps were marked not just with terrain or enemy divisions, but with suspected 88 zones, places where death could come from nowhere. Recon pilots were briefed with one phrase burned into their orders: find the 88s first, because if you didn't, the price was metal, blood, and delay. Even elite divisions like the 101st Airborne and British Paras, known for fearlessness, treaded carefully when facing possible flak lines. Their officers knew that bravery alone meant nothing against a weapon that could erase a jeep or tear through a stone wall with a single shot. Courage wasn't the question. Survival was. What made the 88 so unique was how it crossed traditional lines. It wasn't confined to a single category. It was anti-aircraft, anti-tank, anti-everything. Allied troops had code names for it, often just calling it the 88, as if it were a person or an entity. They spoke of it not like machinery, but like a monster in the fog. German propaganda understood its power too. Posters showed proud artillery crews standing beside the towering barrel of the Flak 88. Films showcased its precision and reach. It became a symbol of German strength, resilience, and technological superiority. Even Hitler reportedly praised the gun as one of Germany's silent generals. But behind every myth was horror. Civilians in France, Poland, and the Soviet Union saw the effects of the 88 not from inside a tank, but from inside their homes. When used for area bombardment, its high-explosive shells reduced buildings to ash. A church in Normandy hit by a Flak 88 didn't crumble, it vanished. The Flak 88's psychological impact extended even to post-war trauma. Veterans who faced it often reported the same nightmares: the piercing crack, the flash, the sudden silence. Medics treated shell shock cases where the patient hadn't been injured, only near an 88 hit. The fear alone was enough to break men. After the war, the Allies studied captured 88s in detail. Some were shipped back to the U.S. and Britain, displayed in military academies like sacred relics of what had nearly stopped the war machine in its tracks. Engineers dissected its carriage, its scope, its firing system, searching for the secret behind its unmatched lethality. And yet, what they found wasn't magic. It was discipline, precision, brutal simplicity. The 88 didn't cheat the laws of physics, it mastered them. It turned timing into a weapon, geometry into fear, steel into legend. To this day, when historians rank the most iconic weapons of World War II, the 88 doesn't just appear, it towers, not for its size, but for its silence, not for its firepower, but for the terror it caused before it even fired. It wasn't the future of war, it was the reminder that sometimes simplicity rules the battlefield. As the war turned against Germany, and Allied forces closed in from both east and west, the Flak 88 remained one of the last things standing between the collapsing Reich and complete defeat. It was no longer just a battlefield weapon. It was the spine of every last stand position the Wehrmacht could muster. In streets, fields, and factory lots, the long barrel still rose defiantly. Berlin, 1945. Soviet T-34s rolled into the smoking ruins of the capital. only to be met by Flak 88s mounted in makeshift positions, some inside buildings, others hidden beneath railway bridges. German teenagers of the Volkssturm, many barely old enough to carry rifles, were assigned to these monsters. They didn't always know how to aim, but they knew one thing: this gun could still kill. In the West, American forces storming into Bavaria encountered Flak 88s hastily dug into hillsides, disguised with tree limbs and cloth. A single gun could still take out an entire convoy if placed correctly. One recorded incident describes a lone 88 delaying an entire armored battalion for nearly 5 hours, firing until its barrel warped and cracked from the heat. By this point, the 88 had become something symbolic. It was less about tactics, more about defiance. The Reich was burning, but the Flak 88s kept firing, not because they could win, but because silence would mean surrender. In many cases, they fired with no hope of supply, surrounded on all sides, using the last shells pulled from looted trains or abandoned caches. Soviet forces often approached suspected 88 positions with caution, even in overwhelming numbers. Their commanders knew that a desperate flak crew, cornered and hopeless, was still lethal. In some cases, Soviet tanks chose to bypass 88 nests altogether, sealing them off and moving on, acknowledging their threat but not wasting blood to confront them. When Allied soldiers began capturing Flak 88s in working condition, they often stared in awe. Some couldn't believe such a massive, precision instrument had been built in 1933. Many thought it was new or experimental. But no, it was just German engineering, aged by war, scarred by recoil, but still deadly. In the final weeks, some crews chose to destroy their Flak 88s rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Others simply walked away, leaving the guns standing like monuments to a war that had consumed them. On some occasions, Allied units advanced cautiously toward a suspected 88 zone, only to find it unmanned, silent, cold. And then the very last shots came. Somewhere near the Czech border, one final Flak 88 fired across a valley, striking a Soviet tank. Its crew, surrounded, destroyed the gun minutes later. That was April 1945. The war was almost over, but the 88 had spoken one last time. After Germany's surrender, the Flak 88 was one of the most requested captured weapons by Allied intelligence. It was studied, measured, disassembled, and shipped across oceans. But nothing they learned was surprising. The secret wasn't in the steel. It was in the way it was used, with patience, precision, and ruthless efficiency. The Flak 88 did not go quietly. It burned barrels, it stood its ground, and in the end, it didn't retreat. It became the last voice of a war machine too proud to surrender and too dangerous to ignore.
When the war ended, the Flak 88 did not vanish into obscurity. It wasn't melted down, forgotten, or dismissed like so many other relics of the conflict. Instead, it was preserved by enemies, allies, and historians alike as the ultimate symbol of a terrifying truth, that sometimes one piece of steel can shift the rhythm of an entire war. Military museums around the world scrambled to obtain a Flak 88 for display.
From London to Washington, from Warsaw to Paris, curators placed them not in corners, but at the center of exhibits. Visitors often mistook them for tanks or large cannons until they read the plaque and realized this was something far more precise, far more feared. In American war colleges, the Flak 88 became a required case study. Tactical analysis courses reviewed its effectiveness in layered defense, ambush, and psychological warfare. Young officers were taught to think like a Flak 88 GRU, seeing terrain as geometry, timing as a weapon, and silence as power. It was no longer just German, it was doctrine. Nations around the world studied it. The Soviets reverse-engineered aspects of the design for their post-war artillery. The French incorporated Flak 88 firing tables into their manuals. Even Israel, during its early years, deployed captured 88s during its War of Independence. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a benchmark. In popular culture, the 88 became legend. War films dramatized its usage. Comic books and pulp novels portrayed it as the enemy's deadliest tool. In one fictional account, a lone German gunner with an 88 holds off an entire Allied company. It was fiction, but not by much. For the men who faced it, however, it wasn't a story. It was a silhouette that haunted memories, a flash in the corner of the eye, a sound you didn't hear in time. Veterans remembered the fear before the shot more than the explosion itself. That silence, that deadly silence. Some survivors returned to Europe decades later. They stood in front of preserved Flak 88s, not as soldiers, but as old men. Some stared at it for minutes without speaking. Others quietly touched the barrel. For many, it was closure. For others, it was a reunion with something they never truly escaped. In post-war Germany, the Flak 88 became both shame and pride. Engineers regarded it as a masterpiece of precision. Survivors remembered it as both protector and executioner. It stood in plazas and war cemeteries alike, silent, heavy, unblinking, a reminder of power misused and brilliance retooled for destruction. To historians, the Flak 88 is a symbol of the industrial age of war, modular, adaptable, efficient. It wasn't born from desperation, it was born from foresight. A weapon designed to be useful, made lethal by necessity, and made legendary by fear. And so, the Flak 88 remains, in steel, in memory, in the dark edges of maps once drawn in blood, not just as a gun, but as the quiet king of World War II.